The Caribbean Sea is heating up more than ever. The United States has been moving a large number of military forces into the region, while panic is spreading in Caracas. Lately, Trump and Maduro have been trading jabs non-stop in the media, and many fear the worst. In Venezuela, there's growing concern that the United States might openly go to war with the Chavista regime, while the White House keeps everyone guessing. That is why it feels important to take a closer look at the military strength of both sides, and see whether the United States is really playing it safe, or if Venezuela could turn into some kind of modern Vietnam. So today we're going to answer a few key questions. What is the current situation of both militaries? What would a war between these two countries actually look like? And most importantly, who would win? Does the Bolivarian government stand any chance at all? Let's get into it. When you compare the military power of the United States with that of Venezuela, the difference is so big that calling it uneven almost feels generous. The United States is the military superpower of the planet, a country capable of projecting force anywhere in the world in a matter of hours. Uncle Sam has military bases scattered across the globe, entire fleets patrolling the oceans, and the most advanced air force ever built. Venezuela, on the other hand, has an army designed to defend its own territory, with limited resources and technology that in many cases has grown outdated after years of crisis and sanctions. First, let me walk you through the real situation of both militaries, and then we'll see whether, despite the enormous gap between them, Venezuela has anything at all to bring to the table. To give you an idea, the United States could launch an air attack and wipe out Venezuela's air defenses before those defenses even realized they were under attack. On top of that, they have drones, precision missiles, satellites, the whole package. It's overwhelming. The US Navy is on a completely different level as well. We're talking about massive aircraft carriers that are practically floating cities, nuclear submarines that can approach any coastline in total silence, and ships loaded with the latest high-tech systems. On land, it's a similar story. The United States has a highly trained army with plenty of experience in international operations, while Venezuela has never been involved in a serious military conflict. But Venezuela's lack of combat experience might actually be the least of its problems. The Venezuelan army hasn't functioned like a real army for a long time. It stopped being a force designed to defend the country and became a key tool for keeping a political project in power. Instead of focusing on planning operations, training its people, maintaining equipment, or developing a modern doctrine, the institution has been packed with tasks that have very little to do with the military. Managing state companies, controlling parts of the economy, monitoring dissent, doing propaganda. On top of that, promotions and rewards don't go to the best soldiers, but to the most loyal ones. That creates a leadership class that obeys political slogans before demanding professionalism from its troops. The result is a chain of command where many officers are more afraid of upsetting the president than of facing an enemy general. And then comes the economic collapse, which has made everything worse. We're talking about rock-bottom salaries, massive loss of personnel, morale that is probably on the floor, and equipment maintenance that is frankly tragic. Add corruption to the mix. When an institution controls businesses, strategic resources, and logistics routes in a country where almost everything is scarce, temptation goes through the roof. Part of the military has grown used to living better, thanks to privileges, doing favors and looking the other way when shady deals appear. When the priority is protecting the perks, national defense becomes secondary. And finally, the economy. A war isn't won with weapons alone, it is won with money. Venezuela, trapped in years of crisis, hyperinflation, and collapsing oil production, simply cannot sustain a long conflict. The United States, on the other hand, is the world's largest economic power. However, even if the United States were to go to war with Venezuela, the resources Washington would be willing to commit would be limited. The United States would never pour its entire military power into Venezuela when it has so many other fronts to worry about. And that is where Maduro's government might find a small window of opportunity. So with all that in mind, what would a war between Venezuela and the United States actually look like? Let's take a look. When we talk about a war between the United States and Venezuela, we're not talking about an invasion like the US did in Iraq in 2003. What's being discussed here is a lightning operation aimed at toppling Maduro, installing a transitional government, and holding clean, verifiable elections to return Venezuela to democracy. Said like that, it sounds altruistic, but the reality in Washington's strategic circles is simpler. The goal would be to remove Maduro and install a friendly government that the US can influence, regain regional leverage, and open Venezuelan gas, oil, and gold to Western markets. In practice, the US plan would look a lot like what Putin tried in Ukraine. We're talking about an operation of at most a week, executed cleanly and efficiently. But just like happened to Russia, that operation can go wrong in many different ways. So how would this potential war actually play out? Washington has concentrated a serious force in the area, roughly 10,000 sailors and marines plus the 5,000 crew aboard the USS Gerald R. Ford. Alongside that floating giant operates an amphibious expeditionary group centered on the assault ship USS Iwo Jima, carrying more than 4,500 marines and escorted by destroyers armed with guided missiles and even a nuclear attack submarine. The United States has also staged F-35 stealth fighters and MQ-9 Reaper drones in Puerto Rico, ready to act. There is an advanced special operations naval base in the area too, the MV Ocean Trader, positioned close to the coast as a staging point for commandos and helicopters from the 161st Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. On top of all that, the US can deploy strategic bombers, including B-2 stealth bombers and B-52s that can take off from US soil, deliver their payloads over Venezuela, and return home in the same mission. Finally, the United States would also count on a fifth column, covert CIA support authorized by the White House to carry out missions inside Venezuela in coordination with local opposition militias that may have been preparing for months. The war would begin with an initial air campaign. Think overwhelming precision bombing of Venezuela's defenses. In the first hours, US destroyers and submarines would launch Tomahawk cruise missiles from positions north of Puerto Rico's, knocking out radars and key air defense batteries. At the same time, F-35 stealth jets would take off from bases in Puerto Rico and from the Gerald Ford to penetrate Venezuelan airspace. B-52 strategic bombers would join the first wave with deterrent strikes against isolated targets. The Venezuelan Air Force, which operates Russian Su-30 Mk2s and a few US-made F-16S, might never get off the ground and could be destroyed on the tarmac. Any attempt to confront the F-35s would likely be futile. By the second day, the United States would establish air supremacy. Most medium and short-range air defense systems, such as Pechora 2MS-125 batteries and Buk M2E units deployed around oil facilities and cities, would be hit by surgical US strikes. With air defenses neutralized and the skies dominated, the invasion would move into its decisive phase. Before dawn on the third day, the joint air and amphibious assault on the Venezuelan capital would begin. From the Caribbean, close to the central coast, MV-22 Osprey and CH-53 helicopters lift off carrying Marine Corps elite units for a surprise landing north of Caracas. At the same time, landing craft from the Iwo Jima and its assault ships go ashore at the port of La Guaira, supported by naval gunfire from nearby destroyers. Almost simultaneously, hundreds of paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division drop onto the two main air facilities serving the capital, Maiquetía Simón Bolívar International Airport and the Generalissimo Francisco de Miranda Air Base east of Caracas. These airborne forces quickly secure the runways despite some firefights with Venezuelan soldiers caught on duty. Immediately after that, Army Ranger teams and Navy SEALs, backed by Night Stalkers flying MH-6 Little Bird helicopters, infiltrate the city and launch lightning strikes against key targets, including Miraflores Palace, the command bunker at Fort Tiuna, and the national communications hubs. Within hours, the Americans would capture or neutralize these targets, leaving Nicolás Maduro's government practically decapitated and unable to coordinate any coherent response. Venezuelan army units stationed in the central region try to react, but the initial blow has been devastating. The 42nd Parachute Infantry Brigade, based in Maracay, about 100 kilometers from Caracas, manages to mobilize part of its forces toward the capital. However, on the highway to Caracas, their convoys come under constant attack from armed drones and US aircraft. Several Russian-made T-72 tanks are destroyed from the air as soon as they leave their barracks. The same thing happens to the 41st Armored Brigade in Valencia, which ends up completely paralyzed. Its armored columns, as soon as they attempt to advance, are detected by satellites and reconnaissance aircraft, and soon after suffer precision strikes that scatter them. In many areas, Venezuelan forces cannot even communicate properly because of the intense US electronic warfare, which jams radios and blinds radars. Isolated and overwhelmed, several regional garrisons choose to surrender without putting up a fight. Meanwhile, internal opposition groups take advantage of the chaos. Small guerrilla cells trained in secret with CIA support sabotage the regime's supply routes and spark local uprisings in cities like Maracaibo and San Cristobal. This mix of external blows and internal insurrection further erodes the Chavista government's ability to respond. By the fifth day of the offensive, Caracas is under the control of United States forces. Marines and airborne troops secure the ministries, the central bank, and other strategic buildings. Nicolás Maduro and his loyal commanders are either captured or flee the country. And there are rumors that some escaped to Cuba on the last planes that managed to take off before Maiquetía fell. Inside the Fuerte Tiuna military complex, Venezuelan officers surrender and agree to halt hostilities in the capital. The tricolor flag is raised again over Miraflores Palace, this time by dissident Venezuelan soldiers aligned with the opposition. The lightning operation would achieve its objectives in about a week with a moderate cost for the invading side. U.S. casualties would be relatively low, estimated in the dozens, thanks to the element of surprise and overwhelming air support. On the Venezuelan side, the fighting would leave hundreds of soldiers dead or wounded, especially during the initial bombings and the clashes in Caracas. As you can see, it looks like a flawless plan. But what if it goes wrong? For Venezuela to repel the invasion, several things would have to happen at once. First, the Venezuelan forces would need a far more effective military response, an unexpected surge in capability that no one is betting on right now. Second, parts of the U.S. plan could go badly wrong. U.S. Special Forces helicopters could be ambushed by large numbers of Igles man-portable missiles. The same could happen if a U.S. transport plane carrying paratroopers were shot down by Chavista air defenses. However, just like in Ukraine, the key to the success of a U.S. attack would be the morale, discipline, and strategy of the Venezuelan army itself. A scenario of total victory implies mass surrenders and large-scale desertions at the front. But what if the Bolivarian armed forces remained cohesive and fought on? For a Chavista victory, Venezuelan commanders would have to absorb the initial shock and fall back in an orderly way, avoiding being annihilated in the open. To pull that off, the government would need to articulate a strong anti-imperialist and resistance narrative. A U.S. bombing that, by mistake, killed a significant number of civilians could become the perfect excuse to unite the Venezuelan population against the invader. In this unlikely scenario where the Venezuelan people offered a broad unified resistance, the armored brigades could withdraw into the cities. Caracas could turn into a deadly maze for the invaders. Small Venezuelan detachments, experts in local terrain, dug into the popular neighborhoods, and armed with anti-tank missiles and snipers, could ambush U.S. patrols constantly. This is where the Bolivarian militia and irregular pro-Chavismo forces would come into play. The government claimed to have between 4.5 and 8 million volunteer militiamen nationwide, a number it will not be able to mobilize. Still, the regime could muster tens of thousands of irregular fighters, scattered through every town and city. These fighters, fighting street by street, would make occupation costly and slow, turning the conflict into a brutal, grinding urban war. If that paramilitary force managed to mount a well-organized guerrilla campaign, like some insurgent groups did in Iraq, U.S. forces could face roadblocks, sabotage, and constant attacks on their supply lines. In that case, Venezuela's aim would not be to win a conventional war, but to drag the situation into a military stalemate that forces the White House to choose between withdrawing and declaring the mission over on the grounds that they were only targeting drug trafficking, or doubling down and launching a long, much larger invasion, something the Trump administration is unlikely to do. Sustaining a counterinsurgency war in Venezuela would be a real test for U.S. forces. Venezuela's terrain, with jungles in the south and vast mountains and plains, would provide natural sanctuaries for Chavista guerrillas able to prolong the conflict outside the cities. That would require massive U.S. reinforcements and secure logistics lines from ports and airfields, which would exponentially increase the cost of the campaign. In that scenario, the United States could win, yes, but at a totally disproportionate price. And now it's your turn. What do you think the outcome of a conflict like this would be? I'll see you in the comments. That's all for today's video. You know the drill. If you enjoyed the story, give it a like, hit subscribe, and dive in for the next one.